Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something that I think is going to be pretty interesting to a lot of our listeners. Um, you know how sometimes there's a major outage that happens and everyone's like, oh, was it a nation state attack or is
Yeah.
it, some sort of massive infrastructure failure?
Yeah.
Well, this one was a little different. It was actually caused by a faulty update from a security company called CrowdStrike.
The
Now,
irony.
right.
The security company taking everyone down.
So we've got a ton of stuff that we've been looking at for this episode, news reports, Reddit threads, technical analyses, and we're going to try to make sense of it all. So
Right.
to give you an idea of what happened, imagine this. You're a surgeon in the middle of an operation, and all
Oh,
of a sudden the hospital servers crash. No more patient records, no imaging, just your scalpel and a whole lot of adrenaline.
it's terrifying.
Absolute terrifying.
And it wasn't just hospitals, it was airports with ride-sharing apps going offline, stranding travelers. Even point-of-sale systems like grocery stores. People had to get out their calculators.
I saw this one comment on Reddit that was like, someone hit the off switch on modern civilization.
Yeah.
And it's kind of true. We're so reliant on these systems.
Yeah.
And so when something like this happens, it really exposes just how fragile things are.
It really does.
So let's talk about CrowdStrike for a minute.
Yeah.
They're a company that specializes in what's called endpoint detection and response. Basically, think of it as next-gen antivirus.
Yeah, on steroids.
On steroids, exactly.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be the last line of defense against things like malware and intrusions,
Hmm.
not the cause of a system-wide meltdown.
Right.
So how did this happen? Well, the technical details are actually kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
The faulty update triggered what's called a cascade of BSOD errors, the blue screen of death.
Oh, yeah.
And it also caused boot loops, essentially turning systems into really expensive breaks.
Yeah. Paperweights.
Paperweights, exactly.
And the worst part, the fix involved booting into safe mode,
Oh, safe mode.
which, if you have one machine, not a big deal. But if you're a large organization with thousands of endpoints,
Oh my God.
it's a logistical nightmare.
A total nightmare. And this whole safe mode thing really highlighted a bigger issue that a lot of people were talking about on Reddit, which is the vulnerability of Windows
Yeah.
to this kind of outage.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not the first time something like this has happened.
Right. And there's a historical reason for that a lot of people don't know about. Back in 2006, the EU had this antitrust case against Microsoft, and they forced Microsoft to grant kernel-level access to security companies like CrowdStrike.
Wait, hold on. Kernel level access. I'm not sure everyone understands what that means. Can you explain it a little bit?
Sure. So think of the kernel as the heart of the operating system. It manages all the critical functions, and giving a third-party application kernel-level access is like giving someone the keys to the control room. It's incredibly powerful, but also incredibly risky.
So you're saying that this ruling, which was meant to promote competition and security, might have actually created a single point of failure that could be exploited on a massive scale.
Exactly, and it raises some really important questions about the trade-offs we make in the name of security. Are we so focused on ticking compliance boxes and layering on security products that we're actually making our systems less secure?
That's a really good point. And it's something that a lot of people were talking about on Reddit as well. This idea that true security isn't just about adding more layers of protection. It's about understanding how systems work
Yeah.
and where the real vulnerabilities lie.
It's about moving beyond security theater and asking hard questions about the architectural choices that make us vulnerable.
Okay, so this is where things start to get really interesting. I was reading this one Reddit thread,
Yeah.
and there was this guy who was running Linux endpoints,
Oh, yeah.
and while everyone else was freaking out,
Except
scrambling to get into safe mode, this guy was just sitting back, sipping his coffee. Probably laughing. And it made me think, maybe there's something to this whole Linux thing.
Yeah,
It's not just about the technical differences. It's a completely different philosophy.
absolutely. In the Windows world, there's this implicit trust in automatic updates, even for critical security software. But in the Linux ecosystem, there's much more emphasis on granular control, on knowing exactly what's changing in your system and why.
So instead of being at the mercy of a bad update, you have the power to choose when and how updates are applied. You can test them rigorously. You can even dive into the code to understand exactly what's changing.
It's about taking ownership of your security, not outsourcing it to a third-party vendor and hoping for the best.
This whole incident has really made me rethink my own approach to security. I used to think it was all about firewalls and antivirus software, but now I realize that it goes much deeper than that.
It really does.
It's about understanding system dependencies, minimizing single points of failure, and having robust recovery plans in place.
It's about thinking like an attacker, probing for weaknesses, and constantly adapting to a changing threat landscape.
And that brings us back to this whole issue of compliance versus true security. I was reading through the Reddit comments, and there were so many sysadmins who were frustrated because they felt like compliance checklists were driving security decisions, even when those decisions made systems less secure.
It's a classic example of checking the boxes without really understanding the underlying risks.
So how do we break free from this compliance trap? How do we move towards a more proactive and effective approach to security?
It requires a fundamental shift in mindset, both for individuals and organizations. We need to start by asking ourselves, what are the actual threats we face? And what are the most effective ways to mitigate those threats? And sometimes the answer won't be found in a compliance checklist.
Sometimes it might mean pushing back against mandates that don't make sense, or exploring alternative operating systems or security solutions, or even questioning the fundamental architecture of our systems.
And it definitely means fostering a culture of security awareness within organizations, empowering users to be part of the solution, not just potential weak points.
Okay, so let's get practical for a minute. If someone is listening to this and thinking, all right, this is all fascinating, but what can I actually do about it? What are some concrete steps that people can take to learn from the CrowdStrike debacle and make their systems more resilient?
Well, the first thing is to understand your dependencies. Map out all the critical software and services that your systems rely on. And for each one, ask yourself, what happens if this fails? Do we have a backup? A recovery plan?
Yeah, it's not just about preventing failures. It's about minimizing the impact when they inevitably happen. And let's not forget about those automatic updates. Blind trust is not a security strategy, especially when a single corrupted file can trigger a global meltdown.
Absolutely. Implement a staged rollout process for updates. Test them rigorously in isolated environments. And always have a rollback plan ready to go. And this might seem radical, but consider diversifying your tech stack. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure.
You know, it's funny. I used to scoff at use a different operating system crowd. But after this whole CrowdStrike fiasco, I'm starting to see their point. Maybe it's time to revisit those Linux tutorials I've been bookmarking.
Think about it this way. If every organization ran identical systems with identical configurations, a single vulnerability could bring everything crashing down. But if there's more diversity, more heterogeneity in the tech landscape, the impact of any one failure is likely to be much smaller.
It's like the difference between a monoculture crop being wiped out by a single disease and a diverse ecosystem that's more resilient to threats. But beyond diversifying systems, there's also this idea of mutable systems that kept popping up in the Reddit threads.
Ah, yes, immutable systems. Think of it as a system where the core components are locked down. Updates are applied in a controlled and verifiable way, and rollbacks are easy and instantaneous.
So instead of constantly patching and updating a system that's inherently vulnerable,
Yeah.
you start with a solid foundation that's much harder to compromise in the first place.
Exactly. Platforms like NixOS are gaining traction in this space, and for those of us who are obsessed with security, it's definitely worth investigating whether they offer a more robust and resilient foundation for critical systems.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the chaos of the outage to the technical deep dive into kernel-level access and the philosophical musings on compliance versus true security. But as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something that often gets lost in these discussions, the human element.
You mean those amazing IT professionals who work tirelessly, often without sleep, to get systems back online?
Absolutely. They are the unsung heroes of this story, the ones who cleaned up the mess and got the world back on track. And their dedication reminds us that technology, for all its complexity, ultimately relies on human ingenuity and resilience.
It also highlights a crucial point. Even with the most sophisticated security measures in place, we can't eliminate human error entirely. And that's why building systems that are robust, adaptable, and forgiving is more important than ever.
So as we move into the second part of our deep dive, here's the question that's been swirling in my mind, and I'm sure it's on the minds of many of our listeners. If a solution designed for security can trigger a global meltdown, what does real security actually look like in our increasingly interconnected world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But I think this whole CrowdStrike incident has given us a valuable glimpse into both the fragility of our systems and the incredible ingenuity of the people who build and maintain them.
It's a reminder that true security is an ongoing process, a constant dance between innovation and vigilance, and a collaborative effort that requires us to think critically, challenge assumptions, and learn from our mistakes.
And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that security isn't just about technology, it's about people. It's about understanding the human factors that contribute to vulnerabilities and building systems that are resilient, not only to technical failures, but also to human fallibility.
Well said. We'll be back in just a moment with the second part of our deep dive into the CrowdStrike outage and its broader implications for security in the digital age.
So where were we?
We were talking about concrete steps people can take
Yeah.
to make their systems more resilient.
Right. So first, understand your dependencies. Like, really map out the software and services that are critical. And for each one, think what happens if this fails. Is there a backup? Do we have a recovery plan?
Yeah, it's like you said before, it's not just about preventing failures, but minimizing the impact when they happen, because let's face it, they will happen. And one thing we haven't really touched on yet are automatic updates,
Oh, yeah.
because blind trust in those is not a security strategy,
No, especially after this whole CrowdStrike thing.
right? One corrupted file brought down so much.
So yeah, think about a staged rollout for updates. Test them very carefully in a separate environment. And always have a rollback plan, just in case. And here's another thing that might sound a little radical.
Okay.
Diversify your tech stack.
Like, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Especially with critical infrastructure.
You know, I used to kind of roll my eyes when people would say, use a different operating system. But now I'm not so sure.
I mean, think about it. If everyone's running the same systems with the same configurations, one vulnerability could take everything down. But if there's more diversity, the impact of any one failure is going to be smaller.
Yeah, it's like that monoculture crop thing. One disease and everything's gone.
Exactly.
But a diverse ecosystem is more resilient. And you know, another thing that came up a lot in those Reddit threads were these immutable systems.
Yeah, immutable systems. So these are systems where the core components are locked down, updates are applied very carefully, and you can verify them, and rollbacks are super easy.
So you're saying instead of constantly patching and updating a system that's already vulnerable, you start with a solid foundation that's harder to mess up.
Exactly. And there are platforms like NixOS that are doing this, and I think it's worth looking into, especially if you're really serious about security.
Okay, so we've talked about dependencies, we've talked about updates, we've talked about diversifying systems, and we've even touched on immutable systems. But there's one more thing I want to bring up, and it's something that often gets overlooked: the human element.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like those IT professionals who worked so hard to fix everything. They're the real heroes of this story.
Totally agree.
And it just reminds us that technology, for all its complexity, ultimately relies on humans.
And you know, it also highlights something really important. We can't eliminate human error, even with the best security measures. So we need to build systems that are robust and adaptable and forgiving.
That makes a lot of sense. So I guess the big question is, if a security solution can cause a global meltdown, what does real security look like?
That is the question, isn't it? And I don't think there's an easy answer. But this CrowdStrike incident has shown us just how fragile things are and how important those IT professionals are.
It's a good reminder that security is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing.
Right. It's a constant dance between innovation and vigilance.
And we need to work together to think critically, challenge assumptions, and learn from our mistakes.
And never forget the human factor.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the CrowdStrike outage and what it means for the future of security.
So we were talking about the human element.
Yeah, you know those IT pros who worked around the clock to fix everything? They don't get enough credit.
No, they really don't.
Yeah.
They're the ones who saved the day.
And it just shows you that even with all this technology, we still rely on people.
Absolutely. And it also highlights something else. We can't eliminate human error.
That's true.
Even with the best security systems in place, mistakes happen. So we need to build systems that are robust and adaptable and can handle those mistakes.
So I guess the big question is, if a security solution can cause a global meltdown, what does real security even look like?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer. But I think this whole CrowdStrike thing has been a wake-up call. It's shown us how fragile our systems really are.
And how much we rely on those IT professionals to keep things running.
Exactly. They're the unsung heroes.
So what do we learn from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that security is an ongoing process. It's not something you set and forget.
It's a constant dance between innovation and vigilance.
Right, and it requires all of us to work together, to think critically, to challenge assumptions, and to learn from our
And
mistakes.
to never forget the human factor. Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into the CrowdStrike outage. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.